Hello, we are transmitting to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century. Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost. Whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you. This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 1014.IS1901, certificate number 1502, the Pyramid of North Dakota.
Now, when you think of pyramids, you usually default to Egypt. But what if we told you there was a 4-story pyramid in the middle of North Dakota?
Well, so when I saw the topic of your show show up in my calendar, I already knew what we were going to talk about, and I was excited to do it. It was on my short list of omnibus topics to cover at some point. But a couple of things. My short list is like 500 topics long. And also, I really have to, or I felt like with Ken, I had to dole out the Cold War spooky archaeology stuff at a pretty, I tried to measure it because otherwise Ken would mock me and torment me that all of my shows were about the F4 Phantom. And now there's no limitations on me at all. I can do shows about personnel carriers, and I can do shows about, shoulder fired missiles for the rest of my career. And there's nobody to stop me. And I'm grateful to you for coming on the show.
I want to give you a hard time about saying Soviet Union.
You do or don't want to?
I won't give you a hard time for that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, I think it's become canonical that there's an L in Soviet. It certainly is how everyone I knew pronounced it all through the 1980s. I didn't even realize I did it until I forget who brought it to my attention, but somebody was like, Soviet? It might have even been Ken on Omnibus.
I think it's in the Civil Air Patrol plane spotter manual from the 60s.
For sure, which I have right on the shelves here somewhere, my Civil Air Patrol, where they, for those of you who were not a child cadet in the 1980s, this was true all the way, I think, back to the dawn of aviation. They would hand out booklets where every kind of airplane was just shown in silhouette because you were tested on your ability to see a tiny little dot in the sky and identify the make and model to know if it was an enemy. And I guess there were ones that showed ships at sea too, right? Silhouettes. Mm-hmm. Silhouettes play such a small role in our culture today, and it seems like we spend a lot of time thinking about silhouettes.
We do, and that the plane spotting was certainly a big part of the Cold War. People felt like they were doing their part by learning that stuff. And I'll segue a bit into, one of the manifestations of my interest in the Cold War has been when I travel, when I'm out and about, I always try to do some research about whether there are any Cold War relics that are in the locations where I'm going to. People would be amazed at how many relics and abandoned places and former sites are out there that are directly related to the Cold War.
So not just Nike missile-based concrete pads, but you're talking about stuff in Turkey? And was there anything in Yemen?
Oh, there's nothing in Yemen, but I was speaking primarily about the stuff in the U.S. and then there is stuff overseas. But the stuff you'll find in the U.S., it's every state pretty much has some stuff that you can find. And one of the good things about the internet is that you can do the research ahead of time and sort of tailor a trip to see these things,
Right.
and be surprised by how much of it is still there and how much of it is now privately owned after being no longer of use to the U.S. government, and through the General Services Administration being auctioned off or sold off to private owners.
My own house has a concrete underground bunker bomb shelter, and when the real estate agent, it was not in the real estate listing, and when the real estate agent showed me the house, I was already interested in it for a variety of reasons, and she just sort of offhandedly said, "Oh yeah, and there's some kind of bomb shelter," and I said, "Some kind of bomb shelter?"
You said you had me at bomb shelter.
Yeah, and she's like, "Go back there," and I go back, and it's a complete 1962, completely intact 1962 bomb shelter, including the rust rings on the floor from the 50-gallon drums of drinking water that had been moldering there, and it had all the filtration, and it's insane. And I use it now to protect against thought beams. I go down there to evade thought beams and mind bullets, and so far been completely successful.
That is a very John-coded house.
For sure.
Did I ever talk to you about my solo motorcycle trip from Georgia to Alaska? Have I told you about that before?
No, you have not, I don't believe.
Well, that is one of the main reasons for the whole conversation today, because back in 2019, just a little before I retired, I decided to do a really big solo motorcycle trip from where I lived in Georgia at the time and Alaska.
Rad.
And I knew that along the way I would try to find a number of Cold War sites. And one of the biggest ones that was drawing my attention along the way in North Dakota was something that we will call the Pyramid of North Dakota. But we're not quite there yet to tell you all the background about the pyramid.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions. First of all, are you an introvert?
I am.
And so a solo motorcycle trip for thousands of miles across basically the plains of America and Canada appealed to you for a variety of reasons, but one of them was just to be left alone for weeks at a time.
I'll put a slightly different spin on that.
Okay.
And the way I approach it is I've done different types of group travel, but most of them, with the exception of one big motorcycle trip, they've all been solo. And I kind of think of it in terms of the committee of one, because there are things I want to see and places I want to visit that might not appeal to other folks out there who
Sure.
might want to see different types of things. And I might want to spend longer at one particular location, or I might want to stop for lunch on my kind of rigid eating schedule that I have. Mm-hmm. And so in those situations, I only have to put the question to the committee of one, which is me. And I think it makes for me anyway, a more enjoyable travel experience.
So this is you having found a way to cater to your neurodiversity in such a way that you're not in conflict with the world.
I don't know if I would go that far, but that's probably a charitable description of what appeals to me about solo travel.
Are you married?
I am married, no kids, and that might account for why I've had the flexibility to travel and do some of the things that I've been able to do over the years.
But so it's a situation where you consider like trying to convince your wife to go down into a flooded Titan missile silo and spend the afternoon climbing down a rusty staircase into the dark and realizing like maybe my wife isn't going to enjoy this as much as I'm going to.
Absolutely. And I think one of the secrets of the success of 21 years of marriage has been that we go on trips together, big trips together, but we also do solo adventures that can scratch that itch for things that might not be of interest to the other member of the marriage.
Has it occurred to you to bid on like a Minuteman silo out in the middle of BFE and build a home in one?
There was actually the longer version of the answer is it starts with the time I spent in the Air Force as a flight leader in security police, responsible for the security of 50 Minuteman III missiles. A short assignment early on in my career in Wyoming involved the missile site security, where we would go out for 3 days, and I oversaw 40 security police members, and they were tasked with the security for 5 launch control facilities that each controlled 10 Minuteman III missiles. And so I got to be kind of up close and personal with what that infrastructure was like. And when I learned many years later about the government selling off or having already sold off some of these old sites, primarily the Titan missile sites, Atlas sites, Nike sites, I would see some that were up for sale that had already been sold into private hands and they were turning over again. But with many of these, if they haven't done any type of work on them with just the work that needs to be done to turn them into a usable structure, it quite literally would become a money pit.
Sure. And just keeping the groundwater out would be a huge...
That has scared me off. I met a couple of people who have done that. One gentleman in Texas bought a former Nike missile site. He was nice enough to let me take a look and spend some time there. And a couple other folks. In fact, we will get to one of them later when we're talking about the sites in North Dakota who did that with one of the missile sites there. We have had the benefit of relative stability with, in some ways, the concept of mutual assured destruction from the two main superpowers who have nuclear weapons. But one of the big potential destabilizing factors over the years has been the concept of anti-ballistic missile systems.
Right.
And
Star Wars.
And that was really tracing its origin back to the Nike missiles that we talked about briefly. And for the benefit of folks not familiar with Nike missiles, they can trace their origin back to the early 1950s, a system that was developed by the Army for anti-aircraft defense.
Oh, yeah.
And, people might ask, shooting down bombers. And people might ask, well, why is the Army responsible? Why does the Army have missiles, number one, that go up in the air as opposed to surface to surface? Why do they have missiles, and why would they be shooting down bombers? And I know you, as a student of history, probably have several web pages bookmarked about the Key West Agreement of 1948.
I read it every morning.
Seminal event in our nation's history, but that was kind of the conference, if you will, where the services kind of hammered out what their roles and responsibilities would be. So you're in that kind of the afterglow of World War II, and we're kind of, as a nation, we're high on the success of our military, but we're also downsizing the mobilization. But we've got all these cool new technologies like nuclear weapons, and we're about to enter the jet age and missiles. So who controls what? And so the Key West Agreement kind of solidified those roles, primarily of air resources, aircraft resources.
Right.
So,
because the Air Force was being invented at that moment.
Yes, the Air Force was only a year old at that point, from 1947, as a separate service. And so what came out of that Key West Agreement, a few things, one being the Navy got to maintain the naval air forces. Of course, the Air Force, though, would be the strategic element in terms of weapons delivery.
The U.S. Navy being the second largest air force in the world.
Yes.
And then the post office is the fourth largest air force in the world.
Well, if you count their drone force that will soon be deployed.
Right.
But the Army came out of that Key West Agreement with a pretty interesting mission, and that was that they would have responsibility for short-range anti-aircraft systems.
And helicopters helicopters and spotter aircraft, and what else does the Army get that flies?
Back then, well, they had fixed wing aircraft. So spotter aircraft, at the time still some field artillery spotting stuff, intelligence collection platforms a bit later on.
Right.
But helicopters really came into their own a couple of years later in the Korean War with the medevac capability and then the troop transport capability also.
So I'm sorry to have interrupted you there. So the Air Force now has strategic air power.
Yes, the Air Force had strategic air power. We had the emergence of the Strategic Air Command, or SAC. And also we had people starting to think about some long-range capabilities. At the time, though, that was just with the bomber force. We didn't have any usable or workable intercontinental ballistic missiles. We wouldn't really see that for at least 10 more years.
We had those German scientists down in their windowless cement rooms. We were saying, get to work.
We did, with Project Paperclip that exported, shall we say, or exfiltrated the best and brightest that we could get out from Germany, and kind of look past some pretty compelling evidence about war crimes and other nasty stuff during the war. And the focus now was on beating the Soviet Union to not just a viable space program, but primarily a defense-focused set of systems. And so the Army was really taking the lead with that. They owned Werner von Braun and his team initially.
Oh, the Army did.
And you had the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, and you had the testing out at White Sands. And all of this kind of led to that Nike missile system. It started with a system called the Nike Ajax system, and those were fielded, as I mentioned, beginning in the early 50s, and with the goal of taking down the Soviet bombers. And you might ask yourself, well, what's the best way to take down these Soviet bombers that are potentially carrying nukes of their own? Well, of course, that's shooting nuclear-tipped Nike missiles at them.
Of course, because you don't have to hit the bomber exactly. You just have to get in the realm of the bomber.
You just have to get close to them. And as we advanced our nuclear weapons technology, of course, we transitioned from the fission weapons of the 1945 bombs into the fusion era of the hydrogen bombs, developed and led by Dr. Teller. So we now were able to speak in terms of megatons instead of kilotons with the yield of these weapons. So the thinking at the time was, let's put nuclear warheads on these Nike missiles and just aim them at these bombers, and presto, we have our defense system.
Now, you said earlier that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which we've talked about on Omnibus before, was a stabilizing factor in geopolitics because we both could blow each other up, and so that meant that it made no sense to ever use these weapons, and so we just sort of sat in a Mexican standoff. But that Nike missiles and the Star Wars technology destabilized that. Can you explain that in greater detail?
Well, anytime that your adversary perceives that you have some leg up on them that would kind of nullify their own nuclear weapons, it gives the adversary the potential advantage of a first strike capability. So if you've had this sort of equilibrium, if you will, with mutual assured destruction, or I love the acronym MAD. Mm-hmm. When I first learned of that in national security classes in college, of course, that makes perfect sense. It destabilizes it because then, let's say in our case, the Soviets might think, well, if the U.S. has this anti-ballistic missile system, they're not worried about our response to an attack, so they might be emboldened to attack us first, have a decapitation effect with these attacks, and the U.S. would win, and we, in this case the Soviets, wouldn't be able to respond appropriately. So that introduces this element of instability into that mad equation.
Because now they're looking at every new development every time a red light goes on, and now they're nervous, and now they have reason to go back to, because there's always the saber rattling generals that believe that we should respond, at the first sign of trouble, or there's there's that sense of Cuban Missile Crisis where you've got a room full of guys and some of them are like, if we're going to survive this, we have to act now. And so an unintended consequence of trying to make ourselves more safe by having the technology to take the enemy's missiles out paradoxically makes us less safe by making the adversary more trigger happy.
Yeah, so that to use your word, triggered sort of an arms race towards having effective anti-ballistic missile systems.
And am I right that there was never really an effective anti-ballistic missile system?
It depends how you define effective. Are you the Government Accountability Office, or are you a member of the military-industrial complex whose stock dividends benefit from continuing this pipeline of contracts to support these programs?
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I am the Government Accountability Office.
I think you will find a very mixed track record if you look at the results over the past several decades with these various systems. And we will get into later on the systems that actually are in place now that people may not realize, and the long road that led us to that, the set of systems that we have, some of arguable benefit and viability.
So my sense is a lot of the tests are ones where they fire a missile from some atoll in the South Pacific, and they tell the missile defense people exactly where it is and where it's coming from and when it's going to be there. And then the missile defense people shoot their missiles up and have about a 40% success rate at even getting anywhere close to it. Am I right? As a government accountability guy, how far off am I from accuracy there?
You could do a real deep dive on the success and failure rate over the years, but there are arguments that the tests have been rigged because of a scenario like you just described, where they are ready, they being the ones doing the launch for the intercept. They know the time frame, they know where this is going to occur, and so they just have to demonstrate the technology of being able to do a mid-air or space intercept of this incoming missile. And that's a great reminder that in the 50s, in the late 50s and early 60s, the threat transitioned from the bomber threat to Soviet ICBMs, because with the launch of Sputnik, that was the shock to the world and to the U.S. that, if they can put a satellite over us, they can use that same platform to drop a warhead on us.
Right. The rest of the world was like, it's beeping. It's a thing flying over that's beeping. And the Army was like, it's going to drop the big one. That's one of the things that I don't think people that didn't live through this period realize or can feel, because it was really a vibe of just constant total paranoia. And it was a vibe that filtered down even to us as children. This sense of like, well, that's a cool thing. How is that going to be used against us? Like, oh, this is an interesting new development. How is that going to be used against us? And I guess it's true in cyber now. I love just calling it cyber. I don't know if that makes me sound like a boomer or whether that's still the nomenclature, but in cyber, there is a sense, right, that every new development there's going to be a take on it that like, well, how is this going to be used against us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's with every new technological development, you will have people out there who are trying to weaponize it or to figure out how does this help us against our adversaries. But now also, I think it's also driven by people and entities that are looking to monetize it.
Right.
And so, getting back to that intercept success or failure rate, we didn't mention yet, but the best way at the time that the U.S. thought to stop these incoming bombers was, of course, a nuclear warhead tipped Nike missile. What do you think they thought was the best way to stop the incoming Soviet ICBMs?
A bigger missile? Or a bigger warhead on the same missile?
Well, a different missile with a different warhead, but it was still the same philosophy that we will use our nukes to take out their nukes.
Yeah.
And so they continued with the development of the Nike missile into the late 50s, into the 60s. It kind of culminated with what was called the Nike Zeus program. So they were really fixated on these Greek and Roman god names for the different iterations of the Nike missiles over the years. But they actually did have a successful intercept test back in 1962, where the Nike Zeus, it achieved a top speed of 8,000 miles per hour, which is over Mach 10, and it did successfully intercept an unarmed U.S. ICBM over the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific. So that kind of convinced the U.S., for better or for worse, that this is a viable technology, this is a viable approach, that we can use our missiles to take down their missiles. But
when you get to Zeus, you don't have much further to go. Zeus had better work. What comes after Zeus?
The alphabet there. But something they hadn't really counted on that spelled the end of this version of missile defense was that Nike Zeus could only track one target per radar system.
Are we going to talk about MIRVs now?
We will talk about MIRVs.
Okay, good.
And we're not talking about people named after Merv Griffin. We're talking about MIRVs. So anyone who grew up when we did in the 70s and 80s and enjoyed that arcade game Missile Command will certainly remember the potential devastation of MIRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. I believe I have the acronym correct. If not,
boy, we sound like such nerds. I hope that futurelinks that aren't like so immersed in this era are still finding this an interesting conversation, because
we've either lost them at MIRVs or we've solidified our hold on them as being very interested in the topic. But as the name implies, this is the concept is, let's build bigger missiles with a bigger what's called a throw weight capability or warhead capability, and we can put multiple warheads in the same missile, and as it's re-entering back into the atmosphere, the nose cone can detach, and these warheads that are independently targeting a different target will then maneuver in that high altitude range and be on a trajectory to take out multiple targets with one missile. So that really undercut any potential effectiveness of the Nike system, because it needed one radar per incoming missile, but then that missile could separate the nose cone, and you've got multiple warheads, but also it could also have decoys. So you can't tell from the radar, is this a decoy or is this a real warhead? So it really caused some, I'm sure, consternation at the time within the Department of Defense and the military-industrial complex of, well, how do we respond to this new threat? Of course, the U.S. was using MIRV technology as well with our missiles to open up the battlefield more to be able to target more strategic locations there. So after Zeus was canceled, we had what was called the Nike X. So we're going back in the alphabet, but Nike X was the name for what would be a successor to Zeus. It's not a high-tech running shoe. When you think Nike X, you might think, oh, this is the latest and greatest from the folks in Oregon.
Well, as people our age know that the letter X is the coolest of all letters, and
absolutely,
it's just cool. It's cooler than a Z by a long margin.
And so that Nike X, without getting into too much minutia here, that was envisioned as a successor to Zeus. It would have a much quicker attack profile, greater standoff profile, but it did not end up being fully developed and fully deployed. But out of Nike X, we had what was called the Spartan missile system. And so all of these missiles kind of built on the previous ones with the technologies, and they were evolutions of the previous ones, but put a pin in Spartan because we're going to come back to that very soon when we talk about how it fits in with the next stage of the anti-ballistic missile system for the U.S.
Okay, go.
Time frame now, we're talking about the late 60s, 1968, 1969. The U.S. wanted to have kind of a more comprehensive approach to ABM, or anti-ballistic missile systems, and there was this proposal for a system called Sentinel. And Sentinel was predicated on this notion that the U.S. would base these anti-ballistic missiles in and around our big cities. I can't think of any reason why a big city would not want to have these missiles located in and around them. Can you?
Well, this was why we built the interstate highway system, right? That we're going to evacuate the big cities with these 5-lane or 3-lane highways. I'm thinking about Seattle now. If we were ringed with nuclear-tipped missiles, how that would go over with the Whole Foods crowd.
It's funny you mentioned Seattle, because Seattle was one of the cities that was envisioned to be part of the Sentinel program. And what came about when all this went public, and there was an effort to sort of sell these big cities on the Sentinel program, you really had the what I would call a NIMBY approach, a not in my backyard approach to this, because it turns out that basing a large number of ABMs to defend these cities actually made them an even bigger target.
Oh, of course.
So you have cities like Boston, Seattle, Chicago, who otherwise, well, maybe they still would have been a big target, but you didn't have a big defense industrial base there. You didn't have a military infrastructure. But now when you're basing these missiles there, that makes them a bigger target. Right. And the mayors of these cities were like, not only no, but hell no. And you also had a lot of pushback. Well, of course, you would have pushback from the Warsaw Pact that just saw this as yet another example of U.S. warmongering.
Right.
But surprisingly, the UK was against Sentinel because they'd kind of been working behind the scenes to bring the U.S. and the Soviets together for continuing arms limitation talks. This was before SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. You also had Canada that was against it because they rightly perceived that this could contribute to strategic instability. We talked about disrupting that mutual assured destruction formula. And so in 1969, as the Nixon administration took over, they surprisingly bowed to congressional pressure. And do you think they just scrapped the Sentinel program because of all this pressure?
I just love that the beginning of this anecdote is the Nixon administration is once again surprises us with their commitment to liberal democracy. But I'm betting what you're getting at is that they did not just pull the plug on Sentinel.
John, you are correct. They did not pull the plug on Sentinel. The great minds of the Nixon administration saw this as a potential rebranding opportunity.
Sure.
So they said, well, Sentinel's not going to work out. What if we rebrand this as Safeguard? And instead of defending the cities and our ICBM sites, I should have mentioned that in addition to the cities, Sentinel would be defending our ICBM sites.
Right.
Let's scale this back. Let's rebrand it. And let's only focus on defending our ICBM sites. So now we don't have the liberal pinkos of the big cities, pushing back. Our reliable Republican supporters and voters in the Midwest and the Northern Tier, they won't mind some more missiles defending the existing missiles that are already out there.
Missiles on top of missiles.
Yes. So we'll pivot and rebrand, and we will have the Safeguard program. Also keep in mind at the time, China, the People's Republic of China, had by now tested their own nuclear weapon. And so we had kind of a dual threat, not only from the Soviets, but a perceived threat from the Red Chinese when it comes to nuclear weapons and potential nuclear annihilation. So Safeguard was a more modestly sized program. It was going to be located in 3 primary areas where we already had ICBMs, our Minuteman ICBMs at the time. So this would be in North Dakota to defend the Grand Forks Air Force Base missiles, in Montana to defend the Malmstrom Air Force Base missiles, and in Missouri to defend the missiles under the control of Whiteman Air Force Base. And so Safeguard as a program, it involved 2 main anti-ballistic missile systems. You'll recall we just mentioned the Spartan missile, which had a better standoff capability, more advanced technology, better radar technology. Add to that equation, we have a missile called the Sprint missile. And you got to give them credit for coming up with a name that is highly descriptive of what this missile is all about.
That missile sounds fast.
The Sprint missile was very fast. And so the concept of defense here was Spartan would be more the standoff capability, while the missiles were still kind of above the atmosphere, coming into the atmosphere. Sprint would be a close-in, short range, quickly accelerating missile that still derived its technology and traced its lineage back to the Nike missile systems as well. So these Safeguard complexes would have those 2 main missile systems. They would have extremely powerful radars that would be able to track multiple incoming targets. They could direct these intercept missiles to take out the incoming ICBMs, and they would also be tipped with nuclear warheads. And again, following with the Key West Agreement, the precedent established with that, this would be under the control of the Army. So I know it's a head scratcher to think of the Army being in control of a system like this, but they were, based on the agreement that was hammered out 25 years before this.
Now, as we've seen, the typically federal agencies specifically tasked with intelligence do not, or did not, and probably do not, do a good job of cooperating with each other. They often withhold secrets that would be mutually beneficial because they're territorial and they're petty. And now you're describing a situation where the Army is charged with defending the Air Force.
Pretty crazy, isn't it?
And just thinking about the very, very little I know about the command structure of the various services, but it doesn't seem like the Air Force would trust the Army with the defense of it.
Well, one thing that you have to keep in mind, when you think of the Army now, you don't really think of the Army being a big user of missiles outside of kind of the standoff field artillery types of surface-to-surface missiles, and of course with the anti-aircraft capability of the Patriot missiles. But back then, the Army was neck deep in the missile game because in addition to this anti-ballistic missile mission that they had with the Nikes, and emerging with the Safeguard program, they also had tactical nukes. So you had you had a number of weapon systems that were tested over the years, short-range tactical nukes, and you had the Pershing missile system that was deployed in Europe and elsewhere. That was a battlefield nuke. I know it just seems possibly hard to fathom the whole concept of battlefield nukes now when we think about it, but that was part of the doctrine back then, was that our strategy for pushing back the Soviet horde as they would come through Germany was to use these battlefield nukes, and they met with huge resistance from the European countries when they were deployed. So the Army was in the missile business,
right?
So it wasn't too much of a stretch to think that they would continue with this anti-ballistic missile mission.
I see.
And so work began to build these three complexes, but a strange thing happened in 1972. The U.S. and the Soviets signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty.
SALT I.
No, this was before. This is a separate treaty. This was the ABM treaty,
right, okay.
Anti-ballistic missile treaty, and the work had begun under the Johnson administration, but Nixon came in with his open-minded and liberal approach to things, of course, and sealed the deal in 1972. And so, even though work had already begun, this new ABM treaty limited each side to only 2 ABM complexes. So Soviets could have 2 and the U.S. could have 2. So the Missouri site was scratched. They had done some initial site work. I don't think they had really broken ground on it. So work continued in North Dakota and in Montana. And this was one of these huge capital projects where lots of money. We'll talk about the price tag later. But it's not something you can just push a button and these things appear overnight. So now we're into 1974, and there's a revised ABM treaty, and now this further limited each side to just one complex, one ABM complex that would consist of 100 missiles and launchers. So Montana, that had construction work already started, that was scrapped. And we were left with North Dakota and what would end up becoming the Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard Complex.
Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard Complex.
So General Michelson was the former commander of the Army Air Defense Command, which was the command that operated their air defense systems, to include the Nikes and the Safeguard program.
It occurs to me now, and it's kind of blowing my mind that it's never occurred to me in exactly these terms before. But one of the main reasons I imagine Canada is protests this stuff is that these battles would all be fought over Canada. Anytime a missile was being intercepted by another missile coming over the pole, if we were doing it right, it would happen over the pole, but probably more likely it would happen over northern Canada.
Yeah, so at the very least, if the balloon went up and the missiles were incoming and the U.S. responded with our ABM systems and the Spartan missiles were launched with their nuclear warheads. And one thing I didn't mention was the size of the warheads on these systems. These were relatively smaller warheads. So we're talking about just to give you some perspective. So the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs at the end of World War II, you're talking between 15 and about 21 kilotons. And then when you're talking about our ICBMs, you're talking about in the much higher megaton range. These ABM systems, so for Sprint, you're talking about in the kiloton range, and for the Spartan, a lower yield, lower than the ICBM yield, 5 megaton yield, and these are the enhanced radiation warheads. So I know growing up, you'll recall talk of the neutron bomb. What's this new thing called the neutron bomb? Well,
it killed people and it left the cities intact.
Kills people dead, to paraphrase an anti-rodent product, but leaves the infrastructure in place. So the warheads on the Spartan and the Sprint systems were these enhanced radiation warheads that of course they have a blast effect, but primarily the radiation is going to disrupt the incoming weapons. So that brings us back to what you suggested. Why would our friendly neighbors to the north of Canada be opposed to these systems? Well, if they're going to have all these nuclear detonations happening over them, you're going to have the effect of how many dirty bombs raining down on top of their population. Not a good way to engender goodwill with the Great White North.
Insane.
So work continued on the Michelson complex, and this was it consisted of 6 main features. The most visible one is, of course, the Pyramid of North Dakota, the subject of this episode of the Omnibus. And the pyramid is, as you can imagine, a pyramid-like structure that was located on the site called the Missile Site Radar. So that element of the safeguard complex consisted of about 460 acres. And this pyramid, which I sought out on my motorcycle trip from Georgia to Alaska, you could see it from about 6 miles away. It's still there. It is about 79 feet in height, and its dimensions from there are 136 feet by 136 feet length. So it's a perfect square, and it has about a 56 degrees of angle. So this missile site radar, it would track the incoming threats, and it would control the Spartan and Sprint missiles that were co-located at that site. So this was the only part of the safeguard complex that had both Spartan and Sprint missiles, which brings us to the next 4 elements of the safeguard complex, which were the remote Sprint launchers, or RSLs. And these were remote sites that were 10 to 20 miles away from the pyramid, and they each consisted of 16 Sprint missiles. So these were the shorter range, fast accelerating interceptors to take out the warheads when they're in their final stages of the trajectory. The 6th and final element of the safeguard complex was what was known as the PAR, or PAR, which was the perimeter acquisition radar. And this was not quite a pyramid-like structure, but it was a big radar that would give sort of over-the-horizon radar capabilities to integrate with and assist with the safeguard complex's visibility of those incoming threats. And so that brings us to 1975, which is a landmark date in the history of the Michelson Safeguard Complex, when it achieved its initial operational capability. Somewhat distressingly, it was on April 1st, 1975, which might not have been a good omen for the future of this complex.
Is there a reason that a pyramid works better than just some towers? And how much of them choosing the pyramid design was just that it looked rad?
Well, of course it looked rad. Yes. You have to think that was part of the sales pitch. Think back, this is late Mad Men era, so you have the Don Draper of the military-industrial complex coming in and selling the decision makers on this plan, and his tagline, of course, is "This looks rad." And it's too bad the Soviets can't see it, but if they did, they would be intimidated enough to just abandon their program. But I think probably the bigger piece of it was that it gave you 360 degree visibility with the radar arrays on all 4 sides.
But you see a lot of Cold War installations that are orbs.
You do, and that's
buckyballs.
That's actually potentially a whole separate omnibus episode when you're talking about the integrated air defense systems that we had in the 50s and 60s, which constitute a lot of the Cold War relics that I've gone to visit. That integrated air defense, most of those were, when you think of like a weather radar or an FAA radar, that orb, that circular design, that dome. So they had a rotating radar within that dome. And I'm not sure why this particular design or technology worked better for this application. I don't have an engineering background.
Oh, okay, so we're back to the pyramid.
April Fool's Day, 1975. That was the initial operational capability. So all of this came together with the Spartan missiles, the Sprint missiles, the radar systems. Everyone was really excited about this. October 1st, 6 months later, they probably had some type of ribbon cutting ceremony where they said, we have achieved full operational capability for the Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard Complex. The future is bright. We will defend the homeland from the Soviet threat. And then the very next day, the House of Representatives voted to decommission the project after they deemed it ineffective.
The very next day, the Defense Appropriations Committee said, got any grapes? And shut it down. And was that in response to a treaty? Was that in response to cost overruns? Was it in response to Pinkos? What was it?
It's a good segue to talk about the cost, because it's hard to put a single price tag on the Michelson complex and the pyramid, because it kind of represents successive missile defense programs from several decades that cost a lot of money. But all the research I could find points to a price tag of about $6 billion with a B dollars for the Michelson complex in
1975,
early 1970s dollars, which Ken would tell you is about $44 billion today.
Wow.
So, of course, this is 1975. Nixon's gone. Ford is there. It's really a difficult period in American history that we as children didn't fully grasp, because just a couple weeks after the Michelson complex achieved its initial operational capability, we had a little issue in Vietnam with the North Vietnamese deciding we'll go ahead and just take all of the South.
Right.
And the U.S. had to kind of evacuate on very short notice. We have the continuing malaise and distrust of government that you would see in the post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era. You also have just questioning, what is the government doing with all of this money? And so Congress, I would imagine, felt somewhat more emboldened, the House of Representatives, to say, yeah, we're just going to pull the plug on this. We've had a mixed track record of tests with the whole concept of missile defense, missile intercepts, and let's just cut our losses. So they did, and it was fully deactivated in April of 1976.
And so we've got Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. What is the current sort of détente vibe, between the superpowers?
So the Cold War, I would say, is still very hot, even though you had the SALT Treaty, you had the ABM Treaty, you had Nixon going to China. You had, at least on the face of it, an effort to reduce the number of nukes that both sides had. But we were still trending. We were on a trajectory into I think 1982 was when we peaked with the number of nukes that we had for the U.S. and the Soviets. The Soviets did end up building their one ABM system was in the Moscow area. I don't know how successful their technology was. I'm sure they had a pipeline of industrial espionage and other types of espionage to somewhat copy what we were doing.
I feel
but they did
100% confident in saying that their system would not have worked.
probably not, but they had to maintain pace with us in the U.S. and get their one system.
Right.
So they got their one system. I don't know how advanced it was and how long it remained in operation. But we pulled the plug on ours in 1976.
Now, do you think that that was a result also of the fact that, A, we recognized that technology was kind of, I mean, Reagan brought back Star Wars. I mean, it was never, the military industrial complex, as you've said, is never going to surrender the idea that they can build a better weapon that does another better thing.
No, that's a great point because it never really went away. The Michelson complex was deactivated, but the concept of anti-ballistic missile defense never went away because we know that questionable government programs never really die. They just get rebranded. And in 1983, as children of the Cold War and Gen Xers, of course, we grew up with Star Wars, and the Reagan administration decided they were going to implement what came to be known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which then acquired the somewhat mocking nickname of Star Wars from both the media and certain members of Congress. And it was, some critics thought that it would violate the ABM treaty, which was still in effect. The Reagan administration thought that, well, it wouldn't because these were space-based interceptors.
Right.
That the spirit of the ABM treaty was that you could only have one ground-based ABM site. Well, look at us. We're going to put these in space, and we're going to have lasers and little interceptors and all sorts of cool technology. And we will further destabilize mutual assured destruction by putting these things in orbit above you and above us.
People will hear me say space lasers a lot, and it's always a reference to the Strategic Defense Initiative because space lasers just became, I thought, even in the 80s, the funniest thing one could say to mock the military industrial complex. But yeah, I was old enough, and you were too at the time, to be reading editorials by this point and reading a lot of this. This violates all the treaties. No, it doesn't. It's based in space. This is ridiculous. It'll never work. No, it's totally going to work. It's totally one, like absolutely going to work. And then they could never really demonstrate that it could work or that it worked.
Well, it hung on through the Reagan administration, through H.W. Bush administration, into the Clinton administration, and then, well, what do we do if we need to kind of re-energize the program, so to speak? Well, we'll rebrand it, right? So it was rebranded, and now it morphed into the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization in 1996. And then in 2002, well, we were due for another rebranding, and it became the Missile Defense Agency. So at this point, with SDI, it was no longer just an Army program. This was a DoD level program, and it wasn't until 2002 when we officially and unilaterally withdrew from the ABM treaty. So all this stuff with SDI, Star Wars, and the rebranding efforts, and various tests of a host of technologies in those years, we had not actually officially withdrawn from that treaty. So in 2002, we did officially, and the work continues. In 2025, we have the next big thing you may have heard called Golden Dome.
Golden Dome!
I have no idea how they came up with that. It probably has nothing to do with the current occupant of the Oval Office's predilection for shiny gold objects,
or just his hair.
We have
is kind of a golden dome.
We have Golden Dome. Yes, that's very on brand for the current administration.
Is Golden Dome under the purview of Space Force?
So it's interesting that you ask who has oversight for this, because within the bureaucracy of DoD, there's an office called the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. Most people have probably never heard of it, but it plays a critical role in oversight for various DoD programs. And the director of that office made a determination that they should have some oversight of this program. Well, that didn't go over too well with Elon Musk and the Doge boys. And they decided to investigate that office, slash its resources. I'm sure it had nothing to do with SpaceX vying to be one of the primary contractors for Golden Dome.
Did they appoint an infomercial host as the head of the Golden Dome?
It's hard to say where things stand with it right now. I know that the Heritage Foundation is loudly advocating for Golden Dome. So if they're behind it, it's got to be a good use of taxpayer resources, and certainly in our national interest.
Who are we protecting ourselves? Which exact ballistic missile system are we afraid of? Like my sense of Russian technology, just based on their invasion and continuing war in Ukraine, is that all of their ballistic missile sites surely are covered in moss, and they don't seem to be able to get their tanks running, let alone like this extremely sophisticated and long neglected system. And the Chinese, although they have nukes, they seem to be more interested in building other things like railroads and like watches and stuff. Like, who are we worried about?
So I think the mission statement, if you can attribute something strategically oriented, like a mission statement to Golden Dome, it's designed to protect us from the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and what are described as rogue nation ICBMs. So it's kind of a
rogue nation ICBMs. What the rogue nations? If they're going to detonate a nuke in the United States, are going to bring it in a backpack.
You've watched too many episodes of 24, John. So that's where we are with anti-ballistic missile defense now. It's all conceptual. Like I said, if you really want, you can do a deep dive on the history of the tests of the different platforms that they've used. Very hit or miss, so to speak, with the success rates. So we don't know where all that will lead. But we do know that there are some very visible remnants of the Michelson complex still out there in North Dakota. If you want to see them, the pyramid is still there. And for a while there was talk of trying to keep it in a caretaker status and remediate what are certainly a lot of environmental hazards there. But it became too much for the General Services Administration or DoD to fool with. So they auctioned it off in 2012 to, of all people, of all entities, the Spring Creek Hutterite Colony of Forbes, North Dakota.
You're kidding me.
I'm not kidding. So
it's owned by an Amish offshoot?
So there had been some changes in ownership, but the first private entity to purchase it were the Hutterites, and they paid $530,000 for it. This is for the missile site radar complex, so the pyramid, and there's the adjacent. There's some support buildings. There are the missile silos for the Spartans and the Sprints there. So for that complex, they bought that. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why a faith-based Amish adjacent group would want this. But from what I could gather in doing some online research, was that they used some of the land for some farming, but it just doesn't make sense to me because the site is a few hours from where their colony is. One would think in central North Dakota there might be better places to farm, but that's what they decided to do. Well, they held on to it. They held on to it for several years, and then they sold off about a third of it to the Cavalier County Job Development Authority.
That's
so
going to do what? Hold raves there?
So they had talked about kind of redeveloping it, restoring it, building an interpretive site, maybe a job training site, because you had some pretty good above ground structures there. But I think after 2 years, they kind of realized this is more than we bargained for in terms of renovation and revitalizing the site. So they sold their portion in 2022. And before I tell you who they sold it to, I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. What would you say is now one of the biggest blights in our suburbs and rural communities? What is really spurring a lot of NIMBYism around the country?
Let's see. One of the biggest blights.
I'll give you a hint.
Yeah.
They're loud and they use a lot of electricity.
Oh, well, is it data processing centers?
If I had a bell, I would be ringing my bell right now. Yes. So a company called BitZero Blockchain Incorporated, which certainly doesn't sound like a fly-by-night operation of any kind.
BitZero Blockchain Incorporated? Wow.
They bought the Job Development Authority's portion of the missile site radar complex, which includes the pyramid, to turn it into a data center for Bitcoin mining.
Oh my God.
We have truly won the Cold War when the pyramid can be repurposed into a Bitcoin mining data center.
The literal worst people in the world, and I don't say that lightly, but the question I have then is, what is the source of electricity there? Because there isn't one as far as I can tell.
Yeah, so I read a little bit of propaganda online from the company and also from the governor of North Dakota at the time, Governor Burgum, who was saying no taxpayer money will go into this. They will be on their own separate grid. It won't have any adverse impact on the 20 people that probably live within 50 miles of the place.
Right. It's a fracking thing where they're going to have their own.
Yeah, ostensibly in all public facing documents and comments, it will be a data center for the Bitcoin mining. But that was 2022. If you go on BitZero's website, it has a section about the pyramid, and it's kind of like a coming soon. Right. We will have this, and they say it's going to be a $500 million data center.
So just to wrap up, you see this thing on your motorcycle 6 miles away, and as you approached it, were you spooked? Were you moved? Did it? And I'm assuming you went inside. If going inside was possible.
I wish I had gone inside. I couldn't get onto the site. I didn't have a point of contact to facilitate that. So I had my drone with me. So I got some pretty good aerial photos and video of the site there. And funny enough, not long after I had done that trip and posted videos about the trip, the TV show Mysteries of the Abandoned had an episode with a segment on the pyramid, and they got to go inside and got to see what it was like inside.
Yeah, I've seen some footage of it inside.
I don't know if the timing is such that they somehow stole my idea or great minds think alike. But yeah, they got to go inside of it.
You really buried the lead here about the fact that on your long distance solo motorcycle trips, you're also carrying a drone.
Additional postscript as far as the remnants of the Mickelson complex. So that perimeter acquisition radar, the PAR, that surprisingly is still in use. It's of course been upgraded, but it's part of it was part of the Cavalier Air Force Station, which is now part of Space Force. So it's part of the Cavalier Space Force Station, and it provides early warning detection capability. And so that is still there.
Wow.
And the 4 remote missile sites, the remote sprint launcher sites, the RSLs, at least one of them is in private hands and it's open for tours. And I did actually get to tour that site, and I have video and photos of that. A very interesting gentleman named Mel, who identified himself as an Army veteran, had purchased the site, done a little bit of refurbishment, I guess, with some environmental remediation, but who knows what I was exposed to below ground when I visited it. If you find yourself near Tacoma, North Dakota, you should certainly make a detour to at least see the pyramid from the outside and time it so you can visit the RSL site number 3 and get to know Mel and get to see what it's like at his former missile site.
Well, Michael, I have enjoyed this entry in the omnibus tremendously, as you can imagine, and I've always wanted to visit the Tacoma Pyramid. And this is just more enticement, both to do that and do it as part of a solo motorcycle trip across the United States, which also has a lot of appeal. But you're so well informed, and your biography is so fascinating and apropos. I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
It's been a thrill for me. I've been a Futureling since the beginning, Patreon supporter. Have really loved all of the episodes. But as you can imagine, the Cold War and some of yours have been towards the top of my list of favorites. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this. It's just been kind of a dream for me to connect with you and to be able to talk about a topic that I had a feeling would be of interest to you as well.
Yeah, well, we got to use all of our favorite acronyms, and Ken is really good at acronyming things on the fly. When you would say 5 or 6 different, he would just be like, "Oh, MIFDORP." And I'm not as good at it, but I really enjoyed all of the different terminology. So fun. You don't get a chance to say MERV very often in our life today.
No, you don't. Certainly not in the context of NIMBYism.
Well, again, thank you, Michael. What a pleasure, and I hope we get to talk with one another again.
And that concludes the Pyramid of North Dakota. Entry 1014.IS1901, certificate number 1502 in the omnibus. Futurelings, you know how I feel about social media. I'm assuming you feel that way too. It's a garbage fire, but the Omnibus Project is perhaps the only good thing about it. And we encourage you to join other Futurelings across the social media sphere, on Reddit, Discord, Facebook, and everywhere else that you might travel. Just go type in Futurelings and see what happens. I mean, probably the first thing you should do is go leave a 5-star review on Apple Music or Spotify, I guess, wherever you consume podcasts. You should email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com. You should, if you prefer to consume your podcasts visually, you can go to youtube.com/@theomnibusproject and watch this episode and all of our episodes, all of our Omnibus 2.0 episodes on YouTube. Please visit our website, omnibusproject.com. You can submit an application to become a co-host, a show proposal, at omnibusproject.com/submit. You can send us physical mail. Care of the Omnibus Project, 609 Southwest 150th Street, number 48084, Burien, Washington, 98166.9998. And in the last, our show is listener supported. So go to patreon.com/omnibusproject and join our community. In fact, today's episode
is the first to feature a pre-episode role of a little bit of a chat, a little bit of a get-to-know-you chat with our co-host, and that is available to Patreon subscribers. So if you were interested in this show, if you'd like to get to know our co-host a little bit better, go to patreon.com/Omnibus Project and sign up at any level of contribution, and you'll have access to our whole history, our whole archive of addenda shows, plus this new bonus, a little bit of a get-to-know-me show. Futurelings, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we wish you many goods and cheese, and hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.